Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little unusual. So, dim the lights, maybe get your favorite blanket, and settle in. We are going to wander through the oddly specific, strangely creative, and slightly uncomfortable world of historical punishments. Don't worry, there's nothing jump-scare scary here. Just a bunch of humans deciding that social embarrassment, inconvenience, or mild pain was a perfectly reasonable way to deal with each other. And of course, they were extremely imaginative. Let's start with something that seems obvious in hindsight: public shaming. It turns out, humans have always been really into making other humans feel embarrassed. In medieval Europe, if you stole a loaf of bread, cheated someone, or even just annoyed your local lord, there was a good chance you'd end up in what was called the pillory. A pillory is basically a wooden frame with holes for your head and hands. You'd stand there in the town square, exposed to the elements, and everyone could throw things at you. Rotten tomatoes, if you were lucky. Mud, if you were unlucky. This was less about hurting you physically and more about giving the town a free afternoon of entertainment. Imagine your neighbors throwing apples at you while quietly thinking, well, at least he didn't steal twice. Some variations of this were even more humiliating. In England, there was a version called the cucking stool. Typically used for women accused of being rude, scolding, or overly bossy, because why not target personality traits? The cucking stool involves strapping someone to a chair and dunking them repeatedly into a river. So, on one hand, you got a nice refreshing swim, and on the other, public humiliation plus the constant threat of drowning. Of course, most of the people dunked this way probably reconsidered ever speaking their mind again. Which, presumably, was the point. Now, if you thought that was a bit extreme, wait until we float over to a slightly more metal scenario. In medieval Germany, there was a device called the breaking wheel. This wasn't subtle. The accused would be tied to a large wooden wheel. Then, in a process that was apparently considered fairly civilized at the time, their limbs would be methodically smashed. Now, don't worry, we are not going to linger on gore. What's interesting here is the psychology. The wheel was less about instant execution and more about prolonged spectacle. Townspeople could gather, watch, and comment, while the condemned person endured the slowly unfolding consequences of, let's say, not minding local law enforcement. Of course, not every punishment involved outright pain. Some were carefully designed for discomfort, irritation, or mild fear. Take the scold's bridle, for example. This metal mask, often adorned with spikes pressing against the tongue, was designed specifically for women who talked too much. Essentially, it turned them into a walking, mumbling ornament. Imagine sitting at a town square bench and realizing that someone nearby is literally wearing a small cage around their face, getting quieted by spikes. It's bizarre, it's slightly terrifying, and also very, very quiet. Some historians argue that the scold's bridle was the medieval precursor to the modern internet block in terms of social silencing. Meanwhile, in France, there was a more public version of humiliation called the shame walk. This could involve being paraded through streets while wearing signs describing your crime, or sometimes even minimal clothing. One particularly memorable punishment involved wearing a large, cumbersome outfit designed to resemble a donkey. You would wander through town, maybe encounter curious children, and probably rethink any life choices that involved theft or gossip. The key idea here is embarrassment as enforcement. Humans are social creatures, after all, and losing face was often considered more terrifying than losing life. Speaking of losing face, the stocks were another form of immobilization. These were essentially wooden restraints for your ankles, sometimes paired with a smaller section for the wrists. You'd sit there for hours, maybe days, exposed to weather, insects, and occasional ridicule from your fellow villagers. Unlike the pillory, the stocks were often positioned lower to the ground, which made sitting somewhat uncomfortable. And when kids came by to kick you or throw mud, you had very little defense. Here, the punishment blended mild physical discomfort with social humiliation. Also, there's something quietly ironic about spending your day complaining about being punished for minor crimes while literally trapped in wood. Some punishments took embarrassment to elaborate extremes. In parts of Renaissance Italy, for instance, people accused of adultery might be forced to march through town wearing a mask with a grotesque, exaggerated nose or a full animal costume. The costume was sometimes determined by the nature of the crime, so if you were caught lying, you might be made to look like a donkey, if cheating, a goat. One can only imagine the conversations that ensued. Yes, I stole someone's heart, but I didn't choose this hat. These public punishments were clearly designed for spectacle. Citizens could gossip, laugh quietly, and then feel morally superior as the punished shuffled past. But humans didn't stop at embarrassment and mild discomfort. There were also devices designed to restrain indefinitely, without necessarily causing death. Consider the Iron Maiden, the infamous spiky coffin-shaped contraption. While most historians agree that these were rare, and some were likely more rumor than reality, the concept is telling. Strap someone inside a metal cage filled with strategically placed spikes, and they couldn't move without impaling themselves. It's the ultimate mild inconvenience meets terrifying ingenuity approach. Again, the goal was more about terror, psychological strain, and long-term suffering rather than immediate death. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, there was a more participatory form of punishment called the roadout. This was primarily for theft or minor fraud. The offender would be tied to the back of a horse, and the community would literally parade them through town. It was humiliating, a little uncomfortable, and very visual. Everyone could see the consequences of bad choices, while the punished person got some fresh air, a horse ride, and an awkward public display. Moving east, in China, punishments often took a different turn, less about spectacle, more about ensuring the message stuck. The kang, for instance, was a heavy wooden collar that locked around a person's neck, with inscriptions about their crime carved into it. They could walk, but movement was restricted, and the inscriptions meant everyone around them immediately knew what they did wrong. It's basically the historical version of a viral social media post, except physical and heavy. You couldn't scroll past it, and there was zero unfollow option. The interesting pattern here is that across cultures, humans have always been very inventive about enforcing social norms. The creativity often leans toward embarrassment, public visibility, and discomfort, rather than quick punishment or fair trial. From parading naked in Italy to the cucking stool in England, the spectrum is wide, weird, and occasionally grotesque, but rarely deadly if you were lucky. And even the deadly ones often had psychological spectacle baked in. Let's float over to another royal disaster. In England, during the reign of Henry VIII, punishment could be both public and highly theatrical. For example, courtiers who displeased the king might find themselves in stocks or pillories, but sometimes with a twist. One famous incident involved a nobleman forced to wear a heavy, iron collar with bells attached, paraded around the court. The bells jingled with every awkward shuffle, announcing their presence and guilt. The combination of metal clanking and public embarrassment created an almost musical punishment, albeit a grim one. And yet, the most famous examples of bizarre punishment often come from everyday infractions. In parts of Germany, there was a device called the Schandmantel, or coat of shame. It was literally a large, cumbersome coat, sometimes with inscriptions detailing the wearer's crimes. Imagine trudging through town in a heavy, humiliating jacket, possibly in the middle of summer, while neighbors snicker and point. You could not escape. You were trapped in your own shame. The concept is simple, really. Make people feel awkward, make them sweat a little, and make sure everyone remembers what they did. By the late Middle Ages, some punishments combined multiple elements. The ducking stool might be paired with public display afterward. The pillory might be placed near market stalls so buyers could pelt you while shopping. Cities became stages, citizens became the audience, and criminals, whether guilty of stealing bread or gossiping too much, were performers in a slightly unpleasant, but strangely entertaining, play. So far, we've looked at embarrassment, mild pain, and some psychological terror. But humans have always found ways to innovate. In the Netherlands, for example, there was a punishment for lying judges. They would be paraded with their heads shaved, faces painted, and signs declaring their wrongdoing. The visual impact was considered essential. Humans seem to respond strongly to spectacle. Maybe it's why we binge reality TV today. And speaking of spectacle, one cannot forget the mask of shame used in certain parts of Europe. Sometimes it was just a simple metal mask. Sometimes it had grotesque spikes to prevent talking. It wasn't about death, injury, or anything dramatic, just absolute social frustration. You couldn't eat, couldn't speak, and certainly couldn't ignore the stares. Perfect for gently persuading people to behave. Finally, it's worth noting that even in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, public shaming was everywhere, just dressed in local style. In Japan, criminals might be paraded with their heads shaved and names written on wooden plaques. In Africa, offenders could be made to carry heavy symbols of their crime through the village. Across time and space, the lesson is consistent. Humans invented elaborate, often uncomfortable, but rarely lethal ways to enforce norms. Alright, so that's a nice, gentle glide through a few bizarre punishments. We've met pillories, stocks, ducking stools, cucking chairs, and scold's bridles. We've paraded through Europe, peeked at Asia, and even considered a bit of royal eccentricity. The common thread. Humans really liked using embarrassment as a tool. It's slow, it's social, and in its own weird way, it's quietly effective. Wheels, collars, and other ingenious contraptions welcome back, everyone. If you're still cozy, maybe stretch a little, adjust your pillow, and let's continue our slow meander through the strange world of historical punishments. Last time, we floated through parades, stocks, and chairs designed to silence people. Tonight, we move toward the more mechanical side of human creativity. Devices that combine minor discomfort with endless curiosity. Let's start with something that sounds like it belongs in a Renaissance fair, but was actually terrifyingly real: the iron collar, or kang, in China. We mentioned it briefly before, but it's worth revisiting in full. Picture a heavy wooden or metal collar, locked around your neck. Sometimes it weighed over 20 pounds. There were inscriptions on it detailing your crime, so everyone passing by could immediately know what you did wrong. This punishment had layers. It restricted movement, was physically uncomfortable, and was socially humiliating. People had to carry it everywhere, eat with it on, sleep with it on. It's hard to imagine a more comprehensive lesson in compliance. And somehow, the elegance of public spectacle combined with sheer inconvenience kept it oddly effective. Now, let's pivot slightly west, to Germany and the infamous breaking wheel, which we briefly mentioned last time. This device was almost sculptural in its creativity. The accused would be tied to a large wooden wheel, and their limbs methodically broken, or in some cases, not broken at all, just positioned so the person could hang there for hours, maybe days. It was a mix of physical punishment and public performance. People would gather to watch, comment, and sometimes even bring snacks. The spectacle was part of the lesson, reminding everyone that bad behavior carried consequences, and that consequences could be entertaining to witness. And speaking of spectacle, the spiked chair deserves attention. You might think of chairs as cozy, supportive furniture, but in medieval Europe, a chair could also be a subtle instrument of suffering. Imagine a simple wooden chair, but with spikes strategically placed to make sitting an unpleasant, mildly painful experience. Some variations were used as interrogation tools, to encourage confession through discomfort rather than outright violence. Others were more ceremonial, used to display someone's guilt publicly. The genius, or madness, of these inventions lies in their dual purpose: social shaming and low-level torment. Meanwhile, in France, they perfected a similar concept with purgatory-like cages. These were small, metal boxes designed to hold a single person for extended periods. Not so much a death sentence, but certainly a long, uncomfortable meditation on life choices. Sometimes these cages were hung in public, so you could wave politely at your neighbors while reflecting on the minor infractions that led you here. It's a kind of punishment that's part physical restraint, part psychological endurance, and part public performance art, centuries before anyone thought to make performance art a thing. Now, let's drift to Scandinavia for a moment. They had a punishment called the road laugh, which, unlike other methods, relied heavily on embarrassment plus mild physical stress. Here, the criminal would be tied to the back of a horse and paraded through town. The horse wasn't particularly aggressive, but the ride was long, awkward, and uncomfortable. People could laugh, point, and comment on your crimes, while you re-evaluated every life choice that might have led to this slow-motion parade. It's a testament to human ingenuity. Why kill someone quickly when you can gently humiliate them for a few hours instead? Back in England, there was a fascination with restraint combined with public observation. The scold's bridle, which we met last time, deserves a deeper look. The spike pressing against the tongue was cruelly efficient, preventing speech while making the wearer acutely aware of their mouth. Women accused of gossiping or scolding could spend hours in this contraption, unable to argue, unable to explain, and forced into a kind of quiet reflection. Interestingly, the scold's bridle wasn't always permanent. Some were designed for repeated use, so you could be put in and out depending on your behavior. Imagine a world where your freedom of speech literally required mechanical approval. It's a charming thought, in a slightly sadistic sort of way. And if we are drifting toward the creatively bizarre, the jester's punishment deserves mention. not for jesters themselves, but for nobles and lower-ranking offenders who displeased them. Some towns in Italy and France employed devices that combined public ridicule with gentle discomfort. For instance, wooden masks shaped like animals, or oversized costumes that forced awkward waddling. The effect was both visual and slightly tiring, ensuring that your crime remained memorable not only to you but to everyone around. Human memory is funny that way. Sometimes discomfort cements lessons far better than fear of death. Meanwhile, in Japan, punishment often relied on combining social shame with physical restriction. Shame poles were common in some villages, tall wooden posts where the offender would be tied for hours, sometimes days, exposed to public view. Their crimes would be posted nearby. The design was simple: immobilize, embarrass, and educate. But unlike some European devices, Japanese methods often emphasized stillness and reflection rather than outright spectacle. You could imagine someone tied quietly, watching life continue around them, pondering the consequences of minor misdeeds. By the late Middle Ages, some punishments started to blend multiple devices. Take the German Schandmantel, the coat of shame. Essentially a heavy, uncomfortable garment that declared your misdeeds for everyone to see. Some versions were studded or adorned to make movement awkward. Others included inscriptions, bells, or symbols that forced the wearer into an ongoing performance of embarrassment. The goal remained constant: social pressure, mild discomfort, and psychological weight. Humans seem to love multi-layered punishments. It's like designing a video game level for humiliation. Of course, not all contraptions were purely public. Some were intended for private reflection, like the captive cage used in certain monasteries for moral correction. Offenders, sometimes monks themselves, were confined in small boxes, forced to sit or stand for long periods. They were uncomfortable, perhaps even slightly claustrophobic, and left alone with their thoughts. Unlike public spectacles, these punishments relied on internalized shame, and, to modern eyes, almost resemble an early form of meditation, but with a bit more judgment and a lot less comfort. Even royalty occasionally faced creative punishments. Henry VIII, despite his many unfortunate decisions, sometimes enjoyed turning social discomfort into entertainment. Courtiers who displeased him could be made to wear cumbersome iron collars with bells, parade awkwardly, or endure public scoldings. These punishments were carefully calibrated to teach lessons without resorting to execution. The bells added an auditory layer to humiliation. Every step jingled, every misstep amplified. It's hard not to admire the subtlety of a punishment that combines physical awkwardness, public observation, and a touch of musical flair. Meanwhile, in parts of Renaissance Italy, punishments for lying, cheating, or gossiping could include combinations of masks, awkward walking, and public announcement. Sometimes, townspeople would be enlisted to assist, making the experience part spectacle, part exercise, and part social lesson. Imagine being dressed as a goat, paraded down cobbled streets, and asked to apologize repeatedly. Over time, it became clear that embarrassment, repetition, and mild discomfort were remarkably effective at teaching compliance, without ever needing a sword. And let's not forget the small, portable punishments. Some towns in France and Germany developed devices like handcuffs attached to short chains, forcing the wearer to move slowly, bend awkwardly, and sometimes interact with the public in odd postures. These devices were ingenious, compact, transportable, and socially humiliating. Perfect for someone whose crimes were minor, but whose presence needed a gentle reminder of rules. Finally, as we drift toward the conclusion of this section, it's fascinating to note a universal pattern. Across cultures and centuries, humans loved punishment that combined restraint, mild discomfort, social observation, and reflection. Whether it was parading naked, sitting painfully in a spiked chair, or wearing a heavy coat of shame, the tools were diverse, creative, and oddly human. No culture, it seems, resisted the urge to turn misbehavior into a slow, mildly inconvenient, socially mediated lesson. So, as you settle further into your blanket, think about these devices, not with horror, but with a quiet curiosity. Humans are, after all, endlessly inventive. And if you ever feel awkward in public, remember, at least you're not wearing a scold's bridle or parading through town in a goat costume. Part 3. Chained benches, pillars, and the art of slow discomfort. Welcome back. If you're still cozy under your blanket, let's continue drifting gently through the world of historical punishments. So far, we've looked at public embarrassment, spiked chairs, iron collars, and parades. Tonight, we are entering the realm of long-duration devices, the punishments designed to make time itself a quiet torment. Let's begin with the chained bench, used in various European towns. The idea is simple: a wooden bench with iron restraints for your hands and sometimes your feet. You could sit, you could not lie down, and you could not escape. People could pass by, throw insults, or, in some cases, offer the occasional snack, which is perhaps the kindest part of the experience. These benches could hold someone for hours or even days. The genius of this punishment wasn't pain, exactly. It was endurance. You'd feel every creak of the wood, every uncomfortable shift in your posture, and slowly understand why minor crimes had consequences. Meanwhile, in parts of Germany and France, there were punishment pillars. Essentially, a tall post or stake to which a person was tied, often in a standing position for hours. Sometimes the arms were extended, sometimes the hands bound at the back. Occasionally, townsfolk would bring chairs or offer shade, but generally, you were left standing, slightly swaying, slightly tired, and endlessly visible. It's a punishment that requires patience, both from the punisher and the punished. Over time, it became a strangely meditative experience. Perhaps not enjoyable, but certainly effective. Now, let's float over to the gibbet, a slightly more dramatic cousin. In England and the Netherlands, criminals could be hanged in chains after execution, or sometimes simply displayed alive for short durations, suspended in public spaces. The gibbet is fascinating because it blends spectacle, restraint, and a slow, lingering reminder to anyone considering similar behavior. Even if death wasn't immediate, being locked in a metal cage above ground was a lesson in patience, humility, and probably mild dizziness. Meanwhile, in Italy, they experimented with torture-like seating devices, but for punishment rather than execution. Imagine a wooden stool or bench, but with protrusions designed to make sitting awkward, combined with straps that kept your posture unnaturally straight. Some designs allowed you to move, but only minimally. Others restricted movement entirely. People could sit for hours, sometimes days, forced to endure the consequences of minor social infractions, gossip, or financial misdeeds. There was a certain elegance to it. The punishment is not deadly, yet profoundly memorable. In Scandinavia, a similar concept existed with the pillory bench hybrid, a long plank where offenders were both restrained and displayed. Villagers could walk by, point, laugh quietly, or even comment on the person's appearance. The punishment was social, physical, and time-consuming. It's worth noting that across cultures, the emphasis was rarely on brutality. The true art was subtle suffering, socially mediated embarrassment, and the long passage of time. Meanwhile, in Japan, punishments often focused on restraint and reflection. The vertical cage, a narrow, tall metal or wooden contraption, allowed little movement. You could stand, maybe shift slightly, but that was it. Villagers could pass, read your crime, and watch your quiet discomfort. Over the hours, perhaps days, the person inside would experience boredom, mild discomfort, and endless opportunity to contemplate their life choices. In some ways, it's almost a precursor to meditation, if meditation involved heavy confinement and a little public shame. Now, let's not forget multi-day dunking devices. In parts of Europe, water-based punishment was taken seriously. Offenders, sometimes women accused of gossip or petty theft, would be strapped to a chair or plank and repeatedly dunked in a river or pond, often for hours at a time. Each dunk was brief enough to avoid drowning, long enough to chill the bones and humiliate the individual. It's remarkable how humans could take a simple concept like immersion in water and turn it into a prolonged psychological experience. Meanwhile, the stocks evolved into long-duration experiments. Not just a few hours, but sometimes days. People were immobilized, exposed to weather, insects, and curious townsfolk. Food might be thrown, mud smeared, or insults shouted. Over time, the stocks became a slow, socially enforced endurance test. You could learn patience, humility, or just acquire a mild hatred for public spaces. Either way, the principle remains: slow discomfort works. In France, the chain cage became popular during the Renaissance. Small, portable, iron contraptions allowed townspeople or nobles to confine someone for extended periods. The design was simple but effective. You couldn't sit comfortably, lie down, or fully stand. Movement was limited, and public observation added another layer of psychological weight. Unlike more lethal devices, the chain cage was subtle, a slow reminder that crime, minor or otherwise, had consequences. Of course, Royalty occasionally enjoyed their own versions of prolonged punishment. Henry VIII, for instance, had courtiers wear elaborate iron collars for days, complete with bells and inscriptions. The combination of weight, jingling, and social observation made the experience simultaneously uncomfortable and humiliating. It's fascinating to think about how much effort went into designing minor annoyances rather than swift execution. Somehow, these subtle punishments were considered more effective. Meanwhile, the king deserves another glance. In some cases, offenders wore it for multiple days, forced to carry the heavy wooden collar everywhere. Eating, sleeping, walking, everything became a subtle exercise in endurance. The inscriptions ensured public knowledge of the crime, and the weight guaranteed mild physical strain. It's a masterpiece of slow, socially mediated correction. Even in Africa and the Middle East, long-duration punishments existed. Offenders might be chained to posts for days, forced to interact minimally with their communities while enduring mild discomfort. The goal was not death, but reflection, social awareness, and endurance. Across continents, the pattern repeats. Humans love punishment that lasts, annoys, and humbles, without necessarily killing. By this point, it's clear that historical punishments were as much about time as anything else. Duration amplified embarrassment, enhanced reflection, and ensured that lessons were memorable. Whether it was a chain bench in Germany, a vertical cage in Japan, or a multi-day cane in China, the principle was consistent: slow, mild discomfort, social exposure, and the occasional public spectacle. Humans, it seems, are extremely inventive when it comes to making each other wait, reflect, and fidget uncomfortably. Finally, before we drift to a gentle pause, it's worth noting the subtle artistry in all of this. Historical punishments were rarely accidental or haphazard. They were carefully calibrated to combine discomfort, observation, and reflection. They were social, psychological, and slightly absurd. And in their own strange way, they reveal a lot about human nature, our desire for order, our love of spectacle, and our persistent creativity in inventing ways to make time a teacher. So, as you continue to settle under your blanket, consider these contraptions not with horror, but with curiosity. There's a rhythm to human ingenuity, even in punishment, and a strange kind of elegance to devices designed to enforce obedience through mild, prolonged discomfort. Part 4. Hybrid oddities and eccentric contraptions. Welcome back, everyone. If you're still cozy, maybe shift a little, adjust your pillow, and let's continue floating through the curious world of historical punishments. By now, we've explored public embarrassment, spiked chairs, iron collars, chained benches, and multi-day endurance devices. Tonight, we enter the realm of the truly eccentric, punishment so inventive, so peculiar, they almost seem like practical jokes. Almost. Let's start with one of the more famous examples, the drunkard's cloak, used in parts of England. Imagine a full-length barrel or oversized coat, worn by someone accused of drunkenness. Sometimes, the wearer would have holes cut for their head and arms, but otherwise, they were trapped inside this awkward, cumbersome object. They would be paraded through town, often pushed along by local children or neighbors. The combination of limited mobility, public spectacle, and social ridicule made it surprisingly effective. And from a modern perspective, it's hard not to admire the sheer creativity. Humiliation meets DIY fashion. Meanwhile, in Germany, the mask of shame evolved into elaborate contraptions. Some were designed to exaggerate features like noses or ears, making the wearer resemble an animal or mythical creature. This wasn't just about embarrassment, it was about performance art. You would march through town, awkwardly mimicking the creature you were dressed as, all the while understanding that misbehavior had consequences. There's a rhythm to these punishments: awkward posture, slight discomfort, public observation, and the inevitable internal reflection. Let's float over to the spinning wheel of mild discomfort, used in certain European villages. Imagine a wooden wheel on a pivot, with straps to secure your hands and feet. Instead of breaking bones, the wheel would rotate slowly, forcing the person to shift uncomfortably for hours. Villagers could watch, comment, and sometimes assist in gentle adjustments. The effect was subtle. The rotation caused mild fatigue, mild embarrassment, and a lot of quiet contemplation. It's almost meditative, if you ignore the straps and the occasional curious child. Now, consider the combination pillory chair hybrids. In some towns, people created devices that immobilized both upper and lower limbs, often with additional restraints for posture control. The result was a forced, awkward sitting position that could last for hours. Public observation was encouraged. Neighbors might walk by, gossip, or even leave notes about the wearer's crime. The subtle genius here is layering: restraint, posture control, social pressure, and mild discomfort, all in one compact, portable device. Meanwhile, in Italy, some courts employed punishment cages with added bells or inscriptions. The idea was simple: confine the person, display their crime, and amplify every movement with jingling bells. Walking became awkward. Sitting became awkward. Even minor adjustments created noise, reminding both the punished and the audience of the offense. It's a device that relies on social reinforcement as much as physical limitation, a combination of theater, inconvenience, and moral education. In Scandinavia, they experimented with seating devices that also restricted arm movement, sometimes called awkward benches. Offenders could sit, but the arms were pinned in uncomfortable positions. Over time, fatigue set in. Balance became tricky. Social observers could offer mild commentary or simply enjoy the quiet spectacle. It's fascinating to think that humans found such elaborate ways to combine restraint with minor pain and psychological discomfort, all while maintaining a socially performative element. Meanwhile, Japan continued to favor vertical confinement devices but occasionally added minor challenges. Offenders might be required to maintain balance on small platforms within narrow cages, or perform minimal tasks while restrained. The goal remained reflection and endurance rather than injury. The design encouraged patience, subtle self-awareness, and quiet observation, qualities often overlooked in modern punishment methods. And then there's the double humiliation, popular in some parts of France. Imagine being confined in a small cage, while also wearing a mask or costume that signaled your crime. You couldn't move comfortably, you couldn't speak effectively, and the public could view both your body and your symbolic representation. It's a layered punishment: mild discomfort, long duration, social observation, and symbolic theater, all rolled into one. In some ways, it's almost artistic, if art were meant to make you fidget and blush simultaneously. Another hybrid appeared in England with the shame stool with bells. A simple wooden stool, but with metal attachments that jingled whenever you shifted. Add in inscriptions or signs detailing your crime, and you've got a device that teaches patience, humility, and auditory awareness. Every movement reminded the wearer, and the community, of minor misdeeds. It's a subtle, almost musical approach to discipline, and it emphasizes social norms without causing severe harm. Meanwhile, in parts of Germany, they combined pillories with benches and spikes, creating multifunctional devices. You could sit awkwardly, remain immobilized, and experience mild discomfort simultaneously. It's a masterclass in inventiveness, combining restriction, posture control, and social spectacle in a single piece of wood and iron. The goal, once again, was psychological effect rather than death or injury. Let's not forget animal-themed punishments, which appeared across Europe. Offenders might be made to wear wooden or metal contraptions resembling donkeys, pigs, or goats, while also restrained in awkward positions. Public observation was essential, and walking through town became a performance of shame. The devices were cumbersome, mildly uncomfortable, and socially humiliating, perfectly aligned with the historical philosophy of subtle correction. Finally, as we drift toward the end of this section, consider the overarching pattern. Across cultures, centuries, and continents, humans continually refined punishments that combined restraint, mild discomfort, social observation, and time. Devices became more creative, more layered, and occasionally more theatrical. The goal remained constant: to enforce norms, teach lessons, and encourage reflection without unnecessary violence. There's a quiet artistry in these inventions, a reminder that human creativity can flourish even in morally questionable spaces. As you continue to sink deeper into your blanket, reflect on these hybrid devices, not with shock, but with gentle curiosity. Humans have always been inventive, patient, and strangely theatrical in correcting behavior. And if nothing else, it's comforting to know that our ancestors, in all their inventiveness, were remarkably consistent in blending mild discomfort, social awareness, and enduring reflection. Part 5. Reflections on Shame, Time, and Human Creativity. Welcome back. By now, we've meandered through centuries of human inventiveness: pillories, stocks, skulls bridles, chain benches, cages, multi-day contraptions, hybrid devices, and the occasional goat costume. If you're still cozy, perhaps adjust your blanket, sip slowly from a warm drink, and let's drift into the quiet lessons behind all this human creativity. At first glance, these punishments may seem cruel, excessive, or just bizarre. And, well, they were a little of all three. But look closer, and a pattern emerges. Across cultures, historical punishments weren't primarily about death. They weren't about instantaneous retribution. They were about time. They were about endurance. They were about embedding social norms into everyday life. Consider the pillory, stocks, or scold's bridle. They are all rooted in the same principle. Human beings care profoundly about what others think. Embarrassment, social scrutiny, and minor discomfort were incredibly effective tools. A person paraded through town in a humiliating outfit or immobilized for hours quickly learned that misbehavior could have consequences beyond any physical pain. It's quiet, subtle, and psychologically profound, a gentle nudge to behave that leaves long-term impressions. Meanwhile, long-duration devices, like chained benches or multi-day cages, emphasize endurance over fear. Sitting uncomfortably for hours, swaying slightly in a vertical cage, or carrying a heavy collar forced reflection. Humans are remarkably inventive when it comes to engineering time into punishment. The slower, the more methodical, the more socially mediated the experience, the deeper the lesson imprinted on both the punished and the observers. Time itself became a disciplinary tool. Hybrid and eccentric contraptions push this philosophy further. Combine discomfort, restraint, public spectacle, and minor performance art, and you have a punishment that is simultaneously theatrical, annoying, and quietly effective. Donkey masks, barrels, bells, spikes, inscriptions, all amplify the psychological weight. The goal was not to harm, but to gently coerce compliance, teach humility, and ensure memory of the lesson. It's discipline as theater, discomfort as reflection, and embarrassment as morality. And yet, there's a subtle irony woven through it all. Humans, across centuries, took great care in inventing ways to inconvenience one another just enough to educate, shame, or remind. They could have executed quickly or punished severely. Instead, they leaned into slow, mildly uncomfortable, socially mediated, and occasionally theatrical methods. There's something quietly humorous in imagining a person paraded in a goat costume, jingling bells with every step, thinking deeply about the ethics of honesty and punctuality. It's absurd, and somehow effective. Moreover, these punishments reveal something about communities. Townsfolk, neighbors, and courts participated willingly, sometimes gleefully, in this subtle theater of correction. Human behavior is responsive to social observation, and historical punishments exploited that beautifully. One could argue that the underlying lesson of all these devices is that humans are social creatures first, creatures of embarrassment second, and creatures of endurance third. Pain is secondary, observation is primary. As we drift toward a close, consider the quiet elegance of these inventions. They reflect creativity, patience, and a nuanced understanding of psychology. They are not flashy or dramatic in the way movies depict punishment. There's no instant gratification, no spectacle of blood or violence. Instead, they are slow, thoughtful, slightly uncomfortable, and socially clever. They make us reflect on time, endurance, embarrassment, and human ingenuity. So tonight, as you settle fully into your blanket, consider these historical devices as gentle reminders. They are more than oddities or curiosities. They are lessons in patience, reflection, and social awareness. Humans have always been inventive, sometimes absurdly so, and often subtle in the ways we teach each other right from wrong. In the end, bizarre punishments reveal a lot about humanity. They are evidence that humans can be cruel, but also highly imaginative. They can enforce rules with elegance, humor, and subtlety. They can remind us, without raising a sword, that society functions on more than laws. It functions on observation, endurance, and the quiet pressure of social norms. So, as your eyes grow heavy and your mind drifts, remember the pillories, the scold's bridles, the chained benches, and the goat masks. Think of them not as instruments of terror, but as oddly sophisticated exercises in teaching, social performance, and patience. And perhaps, quietly, they can teach us still. Sometimes reflection is more effective than force, and mild discomfort, coupled with time, can be surprisingly transformative. Good night, and may your dreams be slightly more comfortable than a chained bench, slightly quieter than a jingle bell punishment, and infinitely more relaxing than a medieval ducking stool.